Bienvenidas.
Andiamo.
So welcome everyone again on our third day. It's been a beautiful journey, these 3 days, intense, I imagine, for us. Lots of food for thought, lots of things that we need to revisit, to continue deepening. This is just a taster for us to continue as we know. I hope you don't leave this formation on the shelf because it was not intended to do so. It's something that can help you to realize that there are many things that we need to learn, to deepen, to share with others, and also to continue learning and reading about it. And also for your General Council teams to continue to journey together, which I think has been very, very helpful. So these 2 last days, we had the forming and developing teams, the process, the challenges, the realities we need to look at. Yesterday, we focused more on the self-awareness and the awareness of others, how important it is to be aware of what is happening inside of us, not only in our minds, but in our bodies, in our emotions, in the way we behave. And that as well helps us to be aware of others and not always take for granted that what we see or perceive, it's what is happening. So we need to journey together on taking stock of what the reality is telling us. And today, as they say in English, last but not least, we will look at conflict transformation, which is a big topic, and more so in a world that arrives to us many times with wars, with lack of peace. And I think that as consecrated life, we have a huge role to play. We are to be witnesses of God's peace in our hearts. That doesn't mean that there's no conflict, but that the peace of God can be stronger. And as sisters that try to live in community and work alongside so many other people, to bring that peace to our environments and to the people that we journey with, to hold peace, to offer peace, to taste peace, even when it's not what surrounds us. So Jesus invites us to be peacemakers. So as we start today's session, I would like to share with you the prayer that will set us on this session. Okay. So as we enter into this learning of transforming conflict, because conflict is a part of life, we ask God to always give us God's peace. And I'd like to do that. I invite you to do that now with a Teze song that just says this: give peace to our hearts. So let us prepare ourselves for prayer, listening to this song.
Da pacem coriu, da pacem coriu, da pacem, da pacem, da pacem coriu, da pacem coriu. Da pacem, da pacem, da pacem, da pacem coriu, da pacem coriu, da pacem, da pacem, da pacem.
So we pray that God, in the midst of the situations that we live, can give us peace. Lord of peace, give us your peace. In times of doubt and shadows that loom over us, may your peace be the light that shines within us. As we walk through conflict, may your peace be the safe ground under our feet. When our words are filled with contradiction, may your peace be the breeze that calms our storms. When our hearts are weary and filled with bitterness, may your peace be the strength that enables our love and gives us words to pray for each other. As our divisions build walls among us, may your peace be the bridge that connects our differences. In the moments we close ourselves from each other, may your peace be the key that unlocks our compassion and mutual acceptance. May the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, guard our hearts and our minds in Christ Jesus. And as we ask the Lord of peace to give us peace, we'll listen to this song that quotes the Beatitude, "Blessed are the peacemakers." The song is translated on the screen in the different languages. So on this note, David, I pass it on to you, and please take the time to explain to us some insights, I'm sure beautiful ones and very important ones, how we can navigate through conflict and try to transform it into meaningful relationships.
Okay. Thanks, Paula. Um, I'm I'm laughing a bit because this
I think you're sharing the wrong screen. Okay. You're laughing, sorry.
yeah, let's see. This is the screen, all right? This one. Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Grazie. So I'm laughing because, this song is certainly what we all desire. We desire to be peacemakers. And and we would desire to be peacemakers not only because God calls us to this through the gospel, and we know that it is one of the most important of the Beatitudes. At the same time, as leaders, we understand that there is a particular time and place for peacemaking, as Jesus said. And so the territory, the theme of our exploration today is a topic that many leaders know is necessary, but most have a certain amount of fear, anxiety around. Because for many of us, we have not had the most positive experiences. But I'm very eager to engage with you today because, from my perspective and my studies and my research and my about 25 years of experience in this field, is that the capability to transform conflict begins with ourselves. And that's where we have the most, in a sense, the most control, um, which we can't say the same about when we talk about other people or situations. Um, so, where we're going to focus our attention today is really this topic of moving toward conflict transformation by understanding our own conflict styles and growing in our own freedom to experiment with other styles. I'll say at the outset that because this topic is a big one, there's a lot to be said about it. My presentation will be a little longer. Natalie Houlihan, who will be speaking to you, will also have time to share as we have in previous days. And we're going to give you some journal time, but then we're going to have a longer plenary session for Q&A. I hope that's agreeable to you all. So just to set a little bit of expectation for the rest of the program today, I want to ask you to take 2 minutes. And the question I have for you as we enter into this topic is, first of all, to consider, when you hear the word, what is it? What is it that it evokes for you? What is your first reaction when you hear the word? How do you tend to orient yourself, in the anticipation of conflict? But in the chat, first of all, when you hear the word, without thinking, what does it stir up for you? Let's look in the chat. Yeah. Miedo, hard. Yeah. Sense of it's avoidable, perhaps. It's a problem. It's about relationships. It's a problem. Fear, alarming, discomfort, differences, restlessness, anger, confusion, trouble. Sure. Peligro, danger. Yes. The need to build fraternity and community, listening, problems, fears. Yeah. This is this is natural, my friends. This is just natural that we have primarily a somewhat fearful way of seeing it. I did see a few comments, by the way, that said this is an opportunity, that this is giving us the possibility, in fact, for some resolution. And that's important too. But notice how that response is in the very small minority of generally the fears we have. And these fears come from our prior experiences. So I'm going to ask that you pause now. Okay, so new life is becoming or being born. There's energy to know the truth about oneself. Time of discernment, wonderful. So you also have a sense, right? The conflict can be many things, not all of them bad. Not all of them bad. That there could be a promise held within conflict. Now, what I'd like you to do is just take 2 minutes in your journal, and I'll give you these 2 minutes now. How do you yourself tend to orient toward conflict? And this is only for you. So, for instance, when conflict begins to arise, do you like to look the other way? Or do you like to stir the pot? This is an expression in English. It's to, in a sense, add to the tension to see what will come out of it. Some of us are like that, by the way. Do you watch from the sidelines as this is kind of a car crash about to happen, but you can't look away? You're kind of engaged. Do you try to suppress it as if it's a fire about to happen? Right? And this invitation is really in your journals. You don't have to make this public to everyone. This is personal. Um, or do you have a very practical response to conflict? You know, conflict happens, we try to resolve it. And I also am curious about who modeled conflict for you. Okay, so 2 minutes for you to consider this um, so that you are, in fact, taking stock. What is your attitude and your style of engaging in conflict? I'll set my timer for 2 minutes. And this is important to me that you have this time to really consider how and in what way you tend to relate to conflict as a person and as a leader, and also this question of who modeled conflict for you and how. Okay, so the reason this is important is that in the next several minutes, we'll be exploring a whole variety of conflict styles that are really a byproduct. They're really the fruit of the way that we were formed, often as very young people. And of course, we change over time. But I can speak for myself that as the oldest of two children, my parents were very loving. And at the same time, when I was quite young, they were also young. And as young people, as young parents, they did not have the maturity to communicate effectively with one another. My mother was often outspoken in her frustration and anger with my father for a variety of reasons. And we had very serious economic financial challenges when I was a child due to my dad's employment or lack of employment. And this created a great deal of fear and anger in my mom for herself and for us. And my dad was someone who tended to go quiet or walk away. This is the way conflict was modeled for me. And what it created for me was a fear of being abandoned if conflict happens. This fear and this anxiety is not surprising, given myself as a child seeing this happening, but it plants a deep seed for me, which I still recognize as an adult. However, if that fear of conflict and that fear of abandonment, right, that fear of not belonging anymore and not having anyone to take care of me, if those seeds were planted at a young age, how do then they affect me as an adult in the way that I engage in conflict now? If I continue to have a self-protective sort of style that tries to make peace at all costs to avoid abandonment, to preserve myself, as an adult and a leader, that can be incredibly problematic, as I'm sure you can understand. So as we continue this presentation, I'm going to try to set some context here. When we think about conflict in our relationships in the service to our mission, this picture I think you might find very evocative. That little child within never disappears. And the question is how we are in relationship with that inner child who often has experienced some mild trauma. And have we been able to heal and outgrow that trauma so that we can respond to conflict now as mature adults with capability? And if not, what is the work that we have to do for ourselves and to support each other in order to get to that level of maturity? For the purposes of our conversation today, conflict is the definition of the combination of some disagreement and emotions being involved. There's other ways of defining conflict, but for the purposes of today, this is the way that we're defining it. Now, typically, when we experience conflict, and this is across the board and across cultures, based on research from our friends at the Leadership Circle, the typical response is that we see conflict as a problem or threat. And that's really been borne out in the chat at the beginning. The vast majority of you have that same feeling. But if we are then prompted by fear to react, our reaction is usually to try not necessarily to fix the problem, but it's to remove those conditions by any ways possible. And if that's our way of managing conflict, and my goodness, how many varieties of conflict are there? We'll talk about them in a minute. Our performance as leaders will be like a roller coaster over time. We will, like firefighters, we'll hear the signal, the alarm, and we'll jump into the truck and we'll put on our gear and we'll race off to the fire to put it out. And then we go home and relax. But then it happens again and again and again and again. And that reaction for us leading organizations that are complex, that have missions and strategic goals, mandates from chapters to accomplish certain ends, this creates a very, very unstable pattern for our organizations. Now, for us as leaders, personally, what gets threatened in a conflict? A sense of our identity, right? A sense of who we are, our sense of safety in some cases, extreme cases, or a sense of our value, our worth. And again, this is taken from the research by our friends at the Leadership Circle using hundreds of thousands of bits of data from individuals. There are patterns to the way that we react when these three things are affected in any way. And for instance, I'll give you an example. I may be a religious superior. And in my community, I hear some some concern or some rumors that people do not trust in my judgment. And instead of putting it in perspective, I immediately can feel threatened in some way and then react. So here's a pattern of the way that these reactions take place. If we are extremely oriented toward relationships, and our data about women religious is that this is a very strong pattern. Our desire to be in relationship and relationships which are peaceful and close, uh, our sense of the need for belonging and the safety and the comfort and really even the pleasure of belonging are so important that we fear to jeopardize these things at all costs. And when we feel threatened and we're concerned about being loved and meeting others' expectations or being seen as someone who contributes joyfully or even our own acceptance by others, this is one pattern, and we can overplay this pattern of seeking belonging and acceptance. Another is if we tend not so much to be concerned about our belonging, but we're very concerned about being seen as right and knowledgeable, to being seen as the one who has authority, the one who understands the situation best. Our tendency can be to distance ourselves. And instead of a kind of emotional response, this is a kind of intellectual response. We revert to a more distant and aloof stance with regard to others. We step back from situations, even if not physically, mentally, and spiritually, to begin to create some safe distance. And finally, another very common trait for those of us who have a great deal of concern for our competence and being able to get things done and achieving results. We, by contrast, may not move toward people at all costs or away from people at all costs, but will move into the matter at hand and try to resolve it using control. And this can be heavy-handed. It can leave us in a kind of micromanaging position. And this is where our needs to be number one or to excel at something, to be perfect, to be in control of situations and dominating for the sake of our organization, or to win. And some of us are competitive. I have to acknowledge that that's really part of my drive as a person. These three patterns are part often of our way. And I'd ask you to think for a moment for yourself. When you feel threatened in some way, when you feel like conflict is touching upon your issues of who you are and what's important to you, sense of safety or a sense of your value, just write in your journals, just for you, what is your tendency? For controlling, for protecting yourself and drawing back, or really moving toward people and trying to huddle with them for your safety. When we think about the invitation of conflict and the transformation of conflicts, we come back to what Pope Francis says about the importance of encounter. And as he says, encounter always means opening up to others as opposed to closing our hearts down, which is the self-protective measure. Francis also says the walls which divide us can be broken down if we're prepared to listen and to learn from one another. Often when we're threatened, this is not so easy, but it is really what we're called to. Now, I'd ask you to consider in the chat very briefly, what are some of the constructive fruits, the constructive promises that could happen on the other side of a successful resolution of a conflict? Let's hear what you have to say. What are some of the potential fruits of a very effective, yes, inner growth, new awareness, deepened relationships, greater intimacy, more trustworthiness, forgiveness, new synergy and ownership, pardon, peace, personal freedom, serenity, transparency, growing, comprehension. By the way, translators, thanks so much for keeping up with me. I know I don't speak as fast as my Spanish and Italian colleagues, but thank you for translating so quickly. Dialogue, respect, better trust and authenticity, right? Growth, new methods and joy, new methods to move forward, freedom, new beginnings. Great, great. Wonderful. So you have a sense. So I'm going to share some of these things that we know from research and from our experience. So we find new solutions and pathways and more fruitful work outcomes because by working through conflict, we're often learning what was at stake and what was the difference, what was at the heart of the difference that led to the conflict. So we can find new pathways, new solutions, new creative ways of doing what we thought we needed to do. Clearly, to learn and to grow personally and as a team or as workmates within our communities. We deepen and enhance the level of participation and creativity. And as you know from being in friendships, when we are successful at resolving conflicts, even long simmering tensions, we enhance the depth of the relationship. We develop new norms for how to be in relationship, just as we do in the group formation process. We also, and this is very interesting, we actually increase the level of motivation for members on a team and our satisfaction in our work. These are some of the many fruits. So even though we have so many fears, I want you to really consider that the fruits of conflict transformation are very, very important. So we're moving into this question of conflict styles and approaches. And before we do that, I just want to say, if you situate yourself in your role for a moment and you consider the various tasks and purposes that you must observe and be responsible for. You as religious leaders, we as religious leaders are responsible for setting boundaries. We are responsible for saying no at times for good reasons, which frustrates people and disappoints people's expectations. We are responsible for negotiating around resources, sometimes with outside vendors who have unscrupulous ways of seeking their own benefit, and we have to take a hard stand with them. We are sometimes, unfortunately, in the relationship even with ecclesiastical authorities who do not have the same opinion about our mission or our works, or they see their own gain. I know that there are situations of conflict between superiors and local bishops, and this sometimes requires a great deal of confidence, of strategic thinking, of clarity and firmness in order to negotiate in those situations. There are situations on our teams. We sometimes have cultural differences that lead us to have very different points of view. And sometimes those points of view are not reconcilable. Sometimes the tension that we carry into our community life from our offices is inescapable, and it piles up so that there's levels of it. And we have to work through layers and layers of conflict in order to have it transformed. This is the life of a leader. This isn't easy, and it's not avoidable. So this question, as we're entering into the subject of conflict styles, is of paramount importance for us as we desire, as we shared yesterday, to have more range, to more notes to play on that piano. If we're only playing one or two notes, this can be so, so difficult. So this instrument that we're introducing now is called the Thomas Kilmann instrument. It is research-based. It's been in use for many decades. And it is a measure of where we find ourselves on a map, in a sense, with regard to our need for assertiveness to get our way, right? And our willingness to be cooperative. And I'll explain this a little bit further. If you were to think about where you find yourself on a scale of assertiveness, where would you situate yourself? Are you very assertive, or are you somewhat meek and a little bit hesitant to really try to get your own point of view across or to get your way? Likewise, on the cooperativeness scale, how willing are you to cooperate with others, to comply with their wishes, to collaborate? And if you are not very cooperative, this means, well, you like your own way and you're going to seek your own way at all costs. If you're very cooperative, you may actually sacrifice your own way often. And our cultures of religious life all play a role here, as well as our own personalities. So if we were to look at where the 5 styles find themselves situated on the map, here's the labels for them, and we're going to work through each one. Just to give you an example of what I mean, though, if I am afraid of asserting myself, and I'm also not the most cooperative person, my style of conflict may simply be to avoid conflict or delay it at all costs. So the lower left. If I'm very accommodating, I like to cooperate with people, and I'm also not very assertive. So I might be really yielding often my way, right? A team has an opinion about what we should do. I might think differently, but I go along because that's really more important to me than my own way. In the middle, we find compromising. And that might be a very attractive word for us, but it also has strengths and weaknesses. Compromising means nobody gets everything they want, right? And as a result, we're primarily trying to find what's the middle ground in our controversy or our challenge, our disagreement. This means that I am moderate in my cooperativeness and I'm moderate in my assertiveness. On the upper left, and I imagine that there are very few of you in this group, as is our experience, that are especially competitive. Some of us are by culture. For instance, in the United States, in Nigeria, in so many parts of India, we tend to have a more competitive way. And the goal is to win. We're assertive and maybe not necessarily as cooperative. And I don't mean to generalize too much. These are stereotypes, so please take that into account. But on the upper right, we have collaborating. That means I'm assertive to a high degree, and I'm also very cooperative. I want the best for others, and I want the best for me. And so my strategy is to find the best solution for both. Okay, so that's a very quick introduction, but we're going to go into more detail over the next 15 minutes or so. There is a worksheet that Paula has that she can share with us. It may not be translated into all the languages, but that worksheet can be a nice reference point as we go through the presentation. And so, Paula, if you're able to share that on the chat, that would be helpful for us. So, as we go into detail, 5 ways to approach conflict. The competing approach, and I'm going to go into this in more detail. As we know, the goal is to win, and this is where it shows up practically. We tend to be more argumentative. We use our formal authority as leverage to get what we want. I'm the superior. I'm the one who has responsibility for this team. I'm the one who has this local responsibility. We assert our opinions and feelings without question. It's not something that we feel reserved about. We stand our ground when we're challenged, and we tend to state our opinions in a very open way without beating around the bush, as we say in English. What's the advantage? Well, the advantage is we can take quicker action when we're assertive in this competitive way. We're willing to make unpopular decisions because the relationship is secondary to, in fact, our desire to get our way. We stand for important issues and we protect ourselves. Okay. None of those things are bad. They can be taken to an extreme. The cons are that we can miss feedback from others. We reduce our learning if we're so competitive and always have to have our way. We can disempower the people who are in the conversation. And often, if we're in a position of formal authority and we're highly competitive, we will surround ourselves with people who basically tell us what we want to hear. And it happens in politics, it happens in religious life. We work constantly with the Vatican. We certainly see this as a pattern in various settings, and it's a byproduct of human nature. Okay, if we are not, and this is important, if we are not using our competitive style, here's what we could risk. We might not have influence in situations. We might actually, in a sense, mirror to people that were not decisive. We also might wait and wait and wait and turn around in circles to make decisions. And we sometimes also withhold our own contributions. So there's an overuse for this style and there's an underuse, right? The overuse has its risks and the underuse has its risks. If we don't see it as part of a repertoire, a part of our toolkit, right, that we can shift into a mode that's more competitive, there's a loss. Okay, so it's not bad, it's not good. It's a tool and it needs to be used in the right measure. And that's the case for all of the other styles. If we look at the opposite extreme, accommodating, by experience, we know that many of us in religious life are accommodating. We want to be humble. We want to be open to others. We want to be modest and meek in our styles. These qualities are often the way that our saints have modeled behavior, but not all of them, right? And if the goal is always to yield, there will be a challenge if we are in leadership, and that's the only note we're able to play. So how does it show up practically? We let go of what we desire. We let go of our core values. We let go of our agendas, and we are selfless. We're putting ourselves aside. That can be very helpful in a spiritual life, but it's not always helpful if you're a leader needing to negotiate for resources. We yield and we're obedient. Okay. So there's, again, strengths and weaknesses. The pros, we're reasonable. We can develop performance that is, in a sense, very team oriented. We create goodwill with others. We keep the peace. We retreat from situations and we maintain perspective. None of those things are bad. They're good, right? They're pros. The cons, we can overlook ideas, we can restrict our influence, we can lose our own contribution. And sometimes if everybody's accommodating and nobody's taking the lead through a conflict, there's anarchy, there's chaos. If we don't use the accommodating style enough, right? So that's the underuse. We have a lack of rapport with others. We're seen as always going our own way. We may actually have low morale ourselves because we're never contributing our voice and our perspective. We're often seen as people who are just rule-oriented and obedient even to a fault. And we may also be seen as unable to yield, unable to collaborate. This is the problem. Okay, so moving on to the next one, avoiding. Now, again, statistically, probably 15% of us, 20% of us might be avoidant of conflict because of prior experiences, culture. Here's what we say. How does it show up in life? Well, we tend to withdraw when we are faced with potential conflict, not just even actual conflict. We sidestep issues and we avoid situations that might be tense. We have a sense of timing, and usually our timing is to get out at just the right moment before things heat up. And and often we will be seen to have an ability to leave things unresolved, to have a tolerance for ambiguity, right? Ambiguity also, is something that as leaders we have to have tolerance for. But as leaders, we also have to be decisive. We have to set agendas. We have to convey a vision. The advantages of the avoidant approach. Well, we know when to leave unimportant issues alone. We have a sense of priorities and measure. We can reduce tensions. We buy time by avoiding situations so we can work things out. We know our limitations, right? And that's not a bad thing. We allow others ownership over the issue. And that passivity sometimes gives us the space to recognize, this conflict is actually a symptom of something deeper. So some of us who tend to be very introverted and have a tendency to want to avoid open conflict and hostility have a kind of reflective capacity to understand what are the underlying causes of a situation. And that's really an asset. The cons, though, we don't offer our input. We might just allow decisions to be made laissez-faire without any kind of involvement. We can allow issues to fester too long. We know that the sexual abuse issue in so many of our communities has festered too long because of a fear of confrontation and a climate of caution. If we don't use occasionally avoidance as a style, this is what can happen. There can be hostility and hurt feelings. We can create too many issues that we're trying to solve at once. And sometimes there's a lack of really being able to prioritize what's important. What are the deep underlying causes, for instance, that we really have to tackle? If we're trying to fight too many fires, this is impossible. Okay? So there are disadvantages if we don't use this style on occasion when it's appropriate. Collaborating. We're on our fourth one. We have one more. We've got several more minutes to go. Just kind of giving you a quick read. Collaborating is a very important style for us, and it is essentially the ability to listen, to empathize, to understand. It is also very evident when we can confront situations, but in a non-threatening way, because we have both high assertiveness and high commitment to the collaboration with others, right? And people sense that. We have a collaborative style and people want to work with us. So even in conflict, they trust that there's a kind of pathway that will be mutually beneficial. So the pros, we think in both and terms. We think about what's good for you and what's good for me. That's good, right? We learn, because to be collaborative requires understanding what are the underlying interests that the other person has. They may take a position, for instance, I need a sabbatical. Okay, well, what are you really concerned about? Well, the person might be burned out and they are fearing, for their vocation, and they're afraid to say that. So they take a stand for sabbatical. But as collaborative problem solvers, we want to understand what's underneath their issue and interest and what is ours. We merge those perspectives. We gain commitment, right? That's mutual, and we improve relationships. The cons. Collaboration takes time. We all know that. Um, and it can be too time consuming for trivial issues, which could be handled much more quickly. It sometimes distributes responsibility to so many people that it's very difficult to work through the conflict in a meaningful way. And if becoming everybody's problem solver is our way, well, that is a lot of work to do. We can't do it. Become overwhelmed. If we don't use the collaborating style, we miss the opportunity for mutual gains. We miss the opportunity to get mutual commitment to shared purposes. We might not empower other people. And certainly there's a loss of creativity if we're not in a collaborative stance. Okay, I hope that's clear. And finally, compromising. You know, Solomon famously decided in the conflict between the two women over the child um, to test them. And in a sense, the compromise was really impossible. Um, and that's really not always possible, but many of us steer in the direction of compromise as a default. And I want to explore, again, what could be the way it shows up and what its implications are. So, how does it show up? Well, we negotiate, right? Like at the market, right? I'll give you this, you give me that, right? That could be compromise. We try to find a middle ground. So you want the this orange for what purpose? I want the orange for something else. Maybe we split it in half, but then we each have half an orange, right? And that's not exactly what we were going for in the first place. We make concessions, we assess the value of things, um, and we try to proceed accordingly. The pros, we resolve issues of moderate importance that way. We reach resolution with equal power and strong commitment, right, for both parties. We create temporary solutions because compromises usually don't resolve long-term complex issues. We deal with time constraints. It's easier to make a compromise sometimes than to collaborate. And we use it as a fallback position. The cons, again, it's a short-term solution. We sometimes miss the bigger picture when we're making compromises. We don't necessarily get to a deeper level of trust. We're still working with each other as if we're at an open air market trying to negotiate the best price for something. And sometimes it can create a somewhat cynical climate if we're working with people and always making compromises. If we don't use it enough, we have unnecessary confrontations, power struggles, and the inability to negotiate. Okay? I know I went fast, but the idea is to understand that each of these styles, each of us probably have one of these styles, which is more typical of our way of dealing with conflict than others. If you recalled a few situations and you thought about your style, right? I'm sure that you'd probably recognize one of these styles along the way. So one of the questions we would have is, what's your most common style and what's your least preferred style, right? If you really can't even imagine competing, right? And that's your least preferred style, to know that. Or maybe you can't even imagine avoiding a situation because everything is too important to you. Okay. It's important to know that. And then it's also important to know your team members and the variety of your styles. If all of you are avoiding or accommodating, this is going to be very challenging for you as a team. If all of you are competing, this is going to be challenging for a team, right? So what are the styles that you find in terms of the other members of your team? This is important to know. We advocate through our program discernment, right? To know where, when, how, and in what manner do we want to stretch ourselves from the style that we tend to use to the one that's necessary at that time with these people in this situation. And that's the way that we understand how to expand, right, the keys of the piano, the range of our possibilities for how we enter into conflict. Discerning when, where, how, and why shall we adopt a different style. Francis, of course, encourages us that at times we have to be willing to make a ruckus. It's an English word. It means make good trouble, okay? Like the prophets did. And we know that Jesus constantly confronts his disciples for their conflicts, which are usually about really silly male competition, right? Who's the greatest? Typical men, right? And when he says, blessed are the peacemakers, yes, but not at all costs. He also said, I came to bring fire and the sword. He understood the importance of confrontation, which he did constantly with those poor Pharisees and scribes. He named where they were hypocrites. He named where they were unjust to the poor. He did it in a very loving and also fierce way. And sometimes we have to be loving and fierce. We're going to hear a testimony in a moment by my friend, Sister Natalie Houlihan from the Loretto Sisters. We've worked with Sister Natalie for a couple of years now, and she's a dear friend. We have very different styles in many ways, and I think that's going to be part of the helpful contribution here to hear as she speaks to her experience. And we ask her, as you have in the past, to consider as you're listening, what does her experience speak to you? Is there anything very helpful about her sharing that really touches you? Okay. And we're going to take a few moments after her sharing for some journaling before we enter into the plenary. And the questions we have for you after these two inputs are here, and we'll put them into the chat as well. So as you look at your preferred conflict style, what gifts does your style bring to your leadership? Because there are many gifts that each style actually carries with them for your leadership. What shadow, right, might there be in the overuse of your style or the underuse of others, right? If you never can imagine yourself entering into a competitive negotiation, what could that mean, right, in terms of the function of your role? If you're never willing to set a hard boundary when someone within your order, your congregation has stepped out of order, what might this mean? What are the costs? And then finally, what do you begin to appreciate about the conflict styles of your other members? So these are the questions we'll ask you to consider after these inputs. And with this, I'm going to stop sharing and turn over the floor to my friend Natalie, and we look forward to her remarks. Thank you so much for your attention. And translators, thanks again for working with me as I'm trying to put in so much in a little time.